Hi everyone, hope you're doing alright. Today is going to be the first episode of my podcast, which has been in development for quite some time. I'm still thinking about what I want to call it. For now, I think I want to call it Divyne Intervention, but I've also been toying with Divyne Chronicles or Crochet Chronicles, so please leave your opinions in the comments below because I still am deciding what I want to call it. But basically, I just want this to be a time that we can just chat and I can give you advice on a certain topic. I do want it to be educational, but not necessarily over-researched, more just sharing my experience and how I think that might be able to help you. So I hope you guys enjoy this podcast. Now, the first episode that I wanted to do is just talking about how I've found my personal style within crochet and how I keep my work inspired. Whilst we talk about that, I am going to be working on my current project, which is this pair of trackies. I'm currently filming a tutorial for these, so that should be out soon, so make sure you guys are subscribed because I'm really excited to see how these turn out. Crochet is such a broad thing. Now, there's so many different things you can do with crochet, so many styles of crochet. So I feel like everything becomes quite overwhelming when you're first starting to learn how to crochet. After you've learned a few stitches and you've tried out a few different projects, you're kind of left in a weird position where there's so many different things you can learn and so many different places to go. I would say it actually took me quite some time in between that point to where I could identify my personal preferences and my personal style within crochet. So it's definitely a journey and I'm definitely still on it, but there are a few things that I suppose I kind of got wrong about crochet at the start that stopped me from being able to do this. So first off, I definitely treated crochet as something that you needed to study because there are so many stitches and there are so many different things you can crochet, and each thing kind of has a slightly different methodology. Like with clothes, you generally turn in between each row, but with doilies you don't, and it's the same with amigurumis. And obviously with doilies you're changing up your rounds, but when it comes to amigurumis there's a lot more counting that needs to be done. But then also with things like garments, you have to think about a completely different set of things compared to amigurumi. With amigurumi you think about structure and shape a lot, whereas with clothes you think about drape, stretch and fit a lot. So I actually spent a lot of time learning a lot of these different things, and I don't necessarily think I needed to. And I do want to mention that you don't need to find your personal style straight away. Honestly, if you want to go ahead and learn how to crochet everything, who am I to stop you? But if you are trying to find your personal style, I actually think this isn't the best approach to take. So this is probably what I would have done instead if I could go back and talk to my younger self. So for example, I learned how to crochet bags first, and then I moved on to garments and accessories and then decor. But what I would have done is I would have learned how to make a few different bags and kind of find a pattern that I somewhat like. And instead of learning all the different ways to crochet bags, I would try and turn that one pattern into something that I would like. I was way more concerned with learning how to do everything that I never actually stopped and considered what I liked doing, as well as what I actually wore. Like, this was a big problem when I first started crocheting, is I would make so many things that I just didn't really know what to do with because I couldn't manage to get something that I actually liked. And I mean, I feel like it's quite self-explanatory, so I don't know why it took me so long to realise, but really to find a personal style, you need to think about you personally. Wow, what an innovative comment, but like, what do I actually mean by this? So if I think back to my personal style at that point, honestly, it's not too different to where I'm at now. But if I look back at what I was making, it really was just kind of whatever I could make at the time I did, and then I just moved on to the next thing. And I feel like that was partially because I was scared of trial and error. Not necessarily in learning stitches, because I'm the kind of person where I will watch like 10% of a tutorial and make it work by myself. But when it came to actually like constructing new things or trying to learn how to do new things, I really didn't do an awful lot of trial and error. But truly, I found a lot of the pieces that I feel like fit my personal style through going through trial and error and either liking the outcome or trying to fix it and then creating an outcome that I like. So an example of this that I can think of is I have a pattern for what I call a graphic mesh vest, which is filet crochet, which is outlined by surface crochet to make the grid kind of pop more. And that came about because I was experimenting with filet crochet and color changing yarn, which I don't think would be recommended anywhere, because now I know more about filet crochet, I understand that filet crochet only works because of the contrast between the mesh stitches and the solid stitches, and adding color changing yarn to that just doesn't allow for that contrast to be seen, so the actual image looked a little bit naff. So that made me come to the conclusion of adding surface crochet around the design, and I really liked the outcome. So much that I've written a pattern, and so much so that still to this day it's one of my favorite patterns that I've made. And that outcome would not have happened if I didn't do that trial and error to begin with. So I would definitely tell myself that I should be experimenting a lot more than I was. So I would say the first thing that I learned the hard way was definitely to focus more on making things that you like, rather than trying to learn all the skills in order to make everything that you like. The skills are going to come kind of either way, but your personal style is developed at your own pace. Now, I feel like in a way I had a head start because, not well, but I have done some form of art for the majority of my life. So I've always had specific things that I go back to, especially in my earlier days of crocheting. I would involve a lot of eyes, which I feel like is part of the like queer art starter pack, but that was definitely part of my personal style. And obviously knowing that in a different context allowed me to include it in the context of my crochet work. Did that stick? Not necessarily, but for a while I really enjoyed it, and it definitely did make my crochet work feel more my own. Now I've talked a little bit about how I would involve kind of progressing my personal style into my crochet work. I want to talk a little bit about inspiration for developing your personal style, because obviously, I would say that there are two main places that you're going to get this inspiration. So the first one is within the kind of art world that you're in. So for example, crochet. I see another crochet piece that I like, and I see how they've done it, and maybe that will inspire me to do something similar. Now, it's so important for me to say here, if you are using an artist as inspiration, please credit them. I would say that that side of inspiration is actually the one that I recommend less. Now, don't get me wrong, there are some amazing crochet artists. I'll put up a few of the crochet artists that I'm really inspired by here, but I find that the inspiration that you apply to your crochet work that doesn't already exist within crochet is going to create the best outcome. So what do I mean by this? Well, there are a lot of pieces that I can think of that obviously I developed a crochet pattern for, but the inspiration was nothing to do with crochet. And I think the easiest example to explain this is my distressed mesh jumper, which is one of my most popular patterns on this YouTube channel. And what that was inspired by is, if you guys have ever played Animal Crossing, and I'm specifically thinking about Animal Crossing on the DS, the way that they represent water is by these kind of like alternating larger circles and smaller circles that are laid out in a way that create kind of like a darker blue like outline. And that was the main inspiration for developing that like freehand textile. And I'm not being funny, I don't think anyone that watched my video on that saw that and then said, oh, that's giving Animal Crossing water. I don't know, maybe they did. But obviously that's because the amount of kind of things that I had to think about and consider and change and develop during the process of using that as inspiration is so much more than that of what I would do if I was emulating someone else's crochet work. And I mean, yet again, I feel like I'm saying so much like self-explanatory stuff, but It's just one of those things that you are going to feel like something's more your work if you do more to it. And you're almost forced to do that when you take inspiration from things that aren't already within crochet. So I would heavily recommend that, as well as being inspired by other crochet artists, that you take your inspiration outside of that as well. A few things that I would say inspire my crochet work but have nothing to do with crochet. Well, obviously my fashion style, but because I grew up with I was about to say grew up with K-pop, and it sounds like I was raised in Korea. My style in clothing has been inspired by second-gen K-pop, kind of consciously and subconsciously. I was definitely one of those kids that would stay inside and just watch K-pop music videos. That was very much my vibe when I was younger. And the striking visuals, especially like that of 21 or even Tiara, I would say really inspired how I wanted to dress, and therefore inspired my crochet work, because obviously I'm crocheting garments, so I'm going to crochet garments that I like, which obviously is influenced by my fashion style. And then on top of that, I have kind of always grown up around varying levels of nature. Now, because I'm in England, a lot of this is just kind of like field, so it's nothing crazy, but definitely like patterns that I've seen within nature. I definitely emulate that kind of ideology to my crochet work. And this is something that has really influenced how I freehand crochet, because if you look at patterns within nature or how things are spread out, it's really visually appealing, but follows not a lot of logical sense past kind of like just probability as like a mathematical idea. Mathematical idea, that doesn't make sense. What do I mean? A mathematical concept. Let's go with that. You guys, I did A-level maths and I do not remember a single thing from it. Or even I would say my inspiration in nature is reflective in my interest in crochet and like the texture. Because if you guys have noticed, a lot of my crochet work doesn't really revolve around a lot of colour work. Like even when I do graphic crochet, it tends to only be 2 different colours. I tend to prioritise texture over colour, and that is definitely influenced by nature. Which I suppose kind of seems counterintuitive because nature's very colourful. But let me live. As I say, I'm in England. I would also say architecture inspires me. My parents used to love going to the national trusts, and obviously I would go with them. So in case you can't tell by my apartment and the fact that I have so much like old crochet now, I really like the aesthetic of more vintage things. And also because I studied psychology, I definitely think that I wouldn't say all of it, because it's quite hard to emulate kind of like a really deep kind of heavier meaning within clothing. But definitely psychology and kind of the human mind and just human nature inspires me as well. And I suppose that one's less so. But I have been thinking, I do want to make some form of like actual crochet artwork. So not like a tapestry, but I think I would just get a frame and do something. So yeah, those are the kind of things that inspired me. And I did just kind of touch on it a little bit. Developing your personal style is also trying new things. Like, you should be prioritizing personal style over learning everything in crochet, but there does come a point where you've developed your personal style, and to develop it even more, you kind of do need to push yourself outside of your comfort zone and try something still within your realm, but something different. I've been doing more decor recently, which has definitely opened my eyes to the fact that I like vintage crochet a lot more than I was probably willing to admit at the start, which partially does have to do with the fact that most of it is done with thread and a tiny needle. But then even then, like, I could develop a way to emulate vintage crochet using thicker yarn, but that would be something that I would do trial and error with. You see, it just all goes back to trying out new things, being inspired, this, that, the other. But really, no one talks about this when you start to learn how to crochet. You're kind of just left there with a bunch of tutorials and everyone else's work, and you just want to like reach for what you can do. But once you've gone past the level of wanting to follow a tutorial for everything you make, I definitely think you're kind of stuck. Yeah, anyway, sorry, tangent. I feel like I keep on getting sidetracked. Those those are a few things that do inspire me, and it's definitely not an exhaustive list. I do want to mention that a lot of inspiration can just be like a one-off thing that you see. Like, especially when I was younger, I was quite good with, if I was out in public and I just saw something that sparked an idea, I would just take a picture of it. Even if the picture reminded me of something else, or that picture wasn't exactly what I wanted to emulate, kind of having those things stocked up really does help you remember ideas. Which kind of brings me on to the next point that I want to talk about, which I feel like a lot of us think about creativity, and the fact that creativity is obviously creating, it's in the name. What I find helps is if you get an idea that you're not really 100% happy with, then keep that somewhere. Keep that like logged somewhere, because in the future that idea might develop, and just because it hasn't developed into anything yet doesn't mean it won't in the future. And an example that I can think of this is I was developing a bunch of bandana patterns at the start of this year, and I had this idea to do this like mesh that used different heights of stitches and different chain lengths to develop kind of like varied mesh boxes, and that would create a bunch of different sized boxes that still lined up mathematically but had kind of like a cool, I don't even know what I'm trying to explain at this point. Like kind of like Great Gatsby-ish, I suppose, where it's just like a bunch of varying sizes of squares and rectangles in this, and I thought that would be really cool. But developing it into a bandana, whilst it was kind of like maybe 70% to what I wanted it to be, wasn't really achieving the outcome that I wanted. But keeping that on the back burner for over half a year now, I've kind of come out the other side and came up with a new idea using that concept. So just because you have an idea doesn't mean you need to do anything with it straight away. I actually think leaving ideas sometimes is a better thing to do than acting on them. I need to stop saying hello as well, because every time I do it, I think of James Charles. Not every creative thought you have needs to be acted on straight away. I actually think that leaving ideas to brew, or even having another idea that you can combine that idea with, leaving time for that can be really helpful. And also, I think when we have a good idea, a lot of us feel pressure to make the idea good, so you might actually have an outcome that you're not 100% happy with because you've just been trying to make it work. So maybe you could have a notepad where you keep track of this. I'm just remembering this now. Back in the day, I used to take like a black picture on Snapchat, which I don't really use Snapchat like that anymore, but I used to take just a blank picture on Snapchat and quickly just sketch a little idea. If I can find any of them, I will insert them here. They would just be horrendous drawings, but it would convey an idea that I had in a way that wasn't too predetermined. So it wasn't necessarily I was identifying what I wanted the outcome to be so much as what the idea was at the moment, so I could look at that image and know what I was trying to reference. Now, to go along with leaving your ideas for a little bit to kind of develop, I also want to touch on trial and error and experimentation in general within crochet. I do feel like a lot of people in crochet are really weird about doing things technically correct, and I don't want to assume who it is, but I do definitely think more experienced crocheters don't like when you crochet in a way that kind of counters the way that they've been taught to crochet. But I actually think trial and error is a really important thing, not only in developing your personal style, but developing good crochet habits, because not only does everyone kind of like different things, but we actually all crochet a little bit differently. Like for example, anytime I do a double crochet, the tension that I have means that the bottom of the stitch is actually really tight, whereas I see other people doing double crochets and the bottom bit is a little bit looser. And if I'm following a lot of what other people do, most people chain 3 to act as a turning chain for a double crochet. But the minute I started doing chain 2 instead, that just made my work look so much neater, my lines were just straighter, and even trying out some of like the hacks to building like turning stitches of like doing 2 single crochets on top of each other to make a double crochet, like that was more messy than me doing a chain 2. And if you ask most people, I would be doing something wrong, but actually through my trial and error, I discovered discovered that that's the way that I crochet the best. Not to say that you shouldn't listen to people that have experience, but maybe you can also take it with a grain of salt. And then along with that side of trial and error, you also have kind of like the freehanding trial and error of crochet. And I feel like this is one of the most important things in developing your own style, is learning how to take something and transform it into something that you would like. And a lot of that comes through trial and error. So just allowing yourself to try new things and all that in theory is lovely, but I think the crochet community has developed this hatred for frogging, which I'm not here to tell you that frogging is the best thing that you can do and you shouldn't hate it, which I should probably clarify. Frogging is when you undo your crochet piece. I use that word like it's in the dictionary, but anything that you're gonna have to frog and redo, I think puts a lot of people off. And it's because you're doing work and not really getting anything out of it physically. But what I'm here to remind you is the learning that you're getting from having to frog and redo, that is what you're getting out of frogging. Honestly, if you're creating crochet pieces and not having to undo any of them, I would say that you're not learning an awful lot, unless you're just the best crocheter ever, which then that's great for you. But for most of us, I do think that challenging ourselves is a really important thing to do. So when you're frogging a piece, please keep in mind that this is actually quite a good thing. It's frustrating, don't get me wrong, but it means that we're learning something new. And learning or trying something new is going to help develop a personal style. Now, to jump off of the back of that, I should probably start, I've just kind of left my crocheting for a bit. Now, to jump off of that, as well as trial and error with creating your own pieces, even when you're like following other people's patterns or other people's tutorials, a good way to develop your personal style is learning how to add modifications to these pieces. Now, obviously, you could stretch as far as changing the stitch that they're using. You could change the shape of things, I don't know. But I suppose for me, I'm talking more about when you have something that you want to make, but maybe it's just kind of like a base for something, or even something as simple as adding a single crochet border in a different color to kind of add an extra interest to something. Learning how to do that and when to do that is also going to help you develop personal style, because it means that you'll be able to make a bigger breadth of things, so therefore you kind of have more to pick. So what I used to do a lot is I used to add appliques to my things, or even like graphic crochet panels I would just sew onto my pieces. And as long as you know how to do that skill that you're adding, it's just an easy way to making your crochet piece more interesting and more personalized. And obviously you don't need to do this with every piece. Some pieces are just nice to be kept as basics, but I also think it's a fun way to experiment. I'm gonna leave the section on developing personal style there, and I want to talk to you a little bit more personally about like what I do to keep inspired and what inspires me. So as I mentioned earlier, like going into nature, going to museums, just going out in the world and just looking for things, looking at things, that does give you inspiration, and it's definitely helpful to do that. But I also do want to mention that I think to be inspired, you also need to be in the right headspace. Like, especially if you're putting a lot of pressure on yourself to figure something out or to finish something, or you're just not in a great headspace, it is really hard to be creative. And for me, I don't so much find this to affect me with my crochet work, and more to do with like the content that I post, where I get so stressed about making things that you guys want to watch, or making things interesting or better quality, that a lot of the stress of doing that kind of clouds up the actual thing of making it individualized and making it my own and making it something interesting. So if you're really feeling uninspired, I think sometimes the best thing to do is just to stop. And I mean, obviously not everyone's in the space where you can just kind of stop and take a break whenever you want. Maybe you just need to hold out a little bit of understanding for yourself that no one's creative all the time. You know, I have months sometimes I cannot think of a new idea of what to do or what to film. And that's fine, because I know as long as I don't stress myself out over it too much and I just try and do what I need to do, eventually, hopefully, a lovely idea will come and I can deal with that when it's there, but kind of forcing it to happen isn't going to help. One thing that I do, which I mean, I feel like everyone does now, is walks. I definitely think walks to a podcast, or even if you can get into the habit of walking without anything in your ears, that does really help kind of settle your mind a little bit. And like, this is the thing, I know what I sound like saying that. I sound like I'm telling you to drink water to get rid of your mental illness. It is kind of true that once you can muster up the mental energy to go on a walk, it is really helpful. And along with that, I do want to mention that I've kind of talked to you about this as if I have all the answers, and I really don't. Like, all of this for me is still stuff that I'm developing and figuring out, but I definitely think that it's something that I've got better at. Not so much staying inspired all the time, but knowing what I like to create and creating a nice little niche for myself to fall into. And before I go, I do actually want to talk to you guys about kind of what can make you uninspired, or at least what I'm find makes me quite uninspired. And I mean, it's not groundbreaking, but anytime I start comparing myself to other creatives, things start to fall apart. And I suppose it's that guilt of I should be doing this, or I should be doing that, or I should be at this level, or I should be producing this type of content, I should be doing that. And in a way, that is almost similar to what I was on about earlier, where if you're comparing your work to a bunch of similar pieces of work, it kind of doesn't seem as special or as personal. But it's really hard to compare yourself to others when you're kind of working within your own... What's the word I'm looking for? Comparison is just kind of a hard thing to deal with in general, but I definitely think once you start creating things that you're creating for yourself, this comparison becomes a little bit easier to deal with. And again, this is something that I don't necessarily feel as much with my crochet work as I do with my content. So maybe I need to do what I did with my crochet work with my content and make my content feel more personal. Right, I am gonna leave this conversation here just because I feel like we're getting a little bit too existential about me posting, which could be a whole other video. Like, you guys, I'm really trying to figure out a way that I can consistently post with things that you like, which I also like creating. I've just been very burnt out, so thank you guys for putting up with me. Any input you have on my content as to what you'd like to see or what you want to see more of, I would love to hear. I'm also hopefully going to post more regularly, especially with shorts and stuff. I think that's something that I struggle with keeping consistent. I don't know, I definitely think it's the fact that I'm not very good with social media, but I'm a perfectionist when it comes to my artwork. So there's a lot of content that I make that I don't put out, which I feel like I need to stop doing. I feel like this also goes along with the topic of the day, but the minute that you're too hard on yourself, you do kind of stifle what you're doing, because you do need place to kind of like play around and, as I say, trial and error. That is definitely the phrase of the day. But anyways, you guys, I'm rambling on. I hope you enjoyed this first episode of this podcast. I'm thinking about doing it every month, but if you guys enjoy it, I could do it more often than that. I don't know, I do actually really enjoy just talking to you guys rather than feeling the need to make kind of a well-structured video. So I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Have a good rest of your day, and let me know in the comments below what you were crocheting whilst watching this. And I mean, that is me assuming that you are crocheting whilst watching this, because that's what I do, which, James, you need to stop doing that. Right, have a good rest of your day, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.